Storage spaces is a new feature in Windows 2012, which allows us to flexibly provision storage, and it can be virtual storage. So basically, it creates volumes from storage pools. And storage pools are basically a collection of physical disks from which virtual disks and volumes can be created and assigned dynamically. And storage spaces can allocate storage using thin provisioning, which basically is dynamically expanding disks that you can provision for a large volume. So pragmatically, what does this all mean? Well, there's this concept called just a bunch of disks, or JBOD. With just a bunch of disks, the idea is that you've got a whole bunch of different technologies and different types of disks laying around that you want to pool into one storage platform. So for example, I might have a couple of SSD drives that I have configured standalone. Maybe I've got a RAID volume sitting around somewhere that's mounted with iSCSI or SCSI or what have you. I've got all these different types of technology. We've talked about all these different types of technologies up until now. But let's say I've got all these different types of technologies with the traditional storage mechanisms in Windows Server before 2012 without using storage spaces. You would only be able to use those storage, all of those different storage technologies within individual drive letters assigned to those individual devices from which you create volumes. But with just a bunch of disks, instead, you can pool all of these different backplanes, all of these different types of technology and so forth that you might have available to you, and make make volumes that can contiguously store data across these different pools of devices. That's the basic idea here. So two more disks can appear as a single disk to the operating system. So with JBOD, you can add a physical disk to a storage pool at any time, and you can expand your storage pool, but just simply by adding additional disks into the pool. So existing volumes can grow into the new space as needed, and you can even add external disks to those pools later on. So some of the features. So disk pooling is a collection of physical disks viewed as a single storage space. So first, you create a pool of disks, and you sort of define, okay, here's all the different disks that I have available, in this giant pool. And then within that pool, you can have data duplication, which finds data existing on a volume multiple times and reduces it to a single instance. Flexible storage layouts. There are three options: simple space, mirror space, and parity space. So when you create your storage layout, it can either be simple, mirrored, or parity, which we talked about already, right? So simple would just simply span the volumes. Mirror is when we can mirror across different volumes. And then parity space is very similar to RAID 5, which we talked about previously, where we stripe parity across our array of disks, and we stripe the data as well. You can also do storage tiering, which combines the speed of SSDs with the low cost and high capacity of HDDs. In other words, you can have a storage pool that contains both SSDs and slower technologies like SATA drives, but the mechanism in Windows Server will make sure that the data that's accessed more frequently lies on the SSD, while data that we use very infrequently will be on the slower technology. So it can dynamically make sure that the data that needs that performance is on the SSDs. So there are three components of a storage space. You have a storage pool, which is one or more physical disks with unallocated space, also called the primordial pool, which is a collection of those physical disks. Then you have virtual disks, which you create from those pools. So from the primordial pool, you sort of create or from your storage pool, you create your virtual disks. And then once you have a virtual disk, you can create a volume on that virtual disk. And every volume uses the virtual disk storage layout and provisioning type. So when you create that virtual disk, you choose a storage layout and a provisioning type from that storage pool. So it's all kind of layered here if you're kind of getting a sense of that. This is what the interface looks like in 2012. Where here we have a primordial pool that's made up of 3 disks, and we can assign those disks to a pool. And this is just kind of a layout of what this might look like. So on the left here, you've got your primordial pool, which might consist of, in this case, there's 7 different disk technologies or a bunch of disks laying around. And from that primordial pool, 2 different pools were created. The first 2 disks created pool 1, the other 3 disks used pool 2, and I have 2 completely unused disks in my primordial pool, which I could use those to create another pool, a pool 3, or I could keep them laying around in case I need more space on pool 1 or pool 2. I could assign those and grow pool 1 or pool 2 by dynamically assigning other disks to it. And then on the right-hand side, those are my virtual disks. So I can create those virtual disks from the pool. And you don't see it on this diagram, but to the right of this would be your actual volumes. So your volumes in Windows would be mounted to those virtual disks. So you could actually have multiple volumes on those disks as well. And then from there, we handle it just like we handle any other disk or any other storage in Windows 2012 Server from the disk manager in Windows. So that's basically what it looks like. And again, this is a new technology in Server 2012, but it certainly adds quite a bit of capability on the storage front to 2012. So you can sort of turn 2012 into a storage server, much like you would find with some of the other vendors like like NetApp or something like that, or QNAP, some of those other types of storage devices, or EMC, where this is basically what they do. So Windows is giving us kind of another tool to do that. Whether it's as good as those tools or not remains to be seen, but certainly an interesting feature that we could take advantage of. So in this unit, we talked about a lot of stuff. We talked about storage in general. We talked about how every server needs to have some kind of storage. The main methods of storage access are local, a direct attached storage, network attached storage, and a SAN, or storage attached network. I stressed the difference between a SAN and a NAS. Hopefully recall that. We talked about how to configure local disks, and we divided that into two broad categories: physical disk properties and logical properties. And then I talked about the different types of disks, like basic disks and dynamic disks, those two types. In Windows 2012, we talked about virtual disks and how you can use those as a regular volume. And then I talked about storage spaces, finally, where we talked about flexible provisioning of virtualized storage by using storage pools, which is what we just talked about. We also talked about storage spaces using the concept of just a bunch of disks, or JBOD, and that two or more disks are abstracted to appear as a single disk in the operating system. Then there was three main components of storage space. There was the storage pools, the virtual disks, and the volumes. And that concludes our discussion on server storage.